Scribes changed our Bible. In some cases, they told us where and why they did it. We call these changes the Emendations of the Scribes. I'm Ross Nichols for HOREB Institute, and this, ladies and gentlemen, is Sunday School. The Emendations of the Scribes, in Hebrew, Tikkun Sopharim. Now, some of you may be familiar with the word tikkun. There's a popular phrase in Judaism, and it's a really great concept. Tikkun olam is typically translated to repair the world or to fix the world, to set things straight. Now, that's a very noble cause, and I'm not going to say that you shouldn't focus on that, but today's class, I want to borrow the first part of that phrase, tikkun. I'm going to talk about tikkun. Again, now, the noble cause of fixing the world is something everyone should be focused on, but just let me borrow this first part. Let's stick through this and let's see if we can figure out what does it mean in the context of today's presentation. Where I really want to focus is on how the phrase is used when we deal with the medieval scholar scribes known as the Masoretes. Now, the Masoretes are the ones who are responsible and credited with giving us the Hebrew Bible as we have it. And they, a big part of who the Masoretes were and what they gave us is the gift of a lot of notes, a lot of detailed lists and various things. We're going to jump into some of that today. Before I do, I want to tell you that in the biblical text, we do have the root word tikkun, or the root word for tikkun, tav, kof, nun. We find that 4 times in the biblical text. Now, you'll see those texts in the chat. Those texts are 3 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. In Ecclesiastes 1:15, in Ecclesiastes 7:13, and in Ecclesiastes 12:9. It appears one other text in the Hebrew Bible, this root word for our word today, tikkun. It also appears in Daniel chapter 4 and verse 33, verse 36 in the English. In every one of those cases, you look it up, and it's typically translated by, let's call it the authorized version, as something along the lines as to straighten. In other words, you're taking something which isn't straight and you're making it straight. We use that today. You're going to straighten something out. You're going to organize it. You're going to put it in order. You're going to establish something. This is really the deepest meaning of what we talk about when we talk about tikkun sopharim. Translated, the emendations of the scribes, it really, at its root meaning, means to straighten out what the scribes straightened out when it comes to the text of the Hebrew Bible. Now, one of the books that I have in my library that I find myself using in classes such as this or studies such as this is a dictionary. It's known as the Jastro's Dictionary of the Targumim, the Talmud Bavli, Yerushalmi, and Midrashic literature. So what this book contains is you look up a particular word or phrase, and you'll see wherever it's used in rabbinic literature. And it comes in very helpful because one of the things that I wanted to look up this week in preparation for this class was the idea of tikkun sopharim. And there's an extensive entry in Jastro's dictionary on that. Didn't give me much more. It basically told me what I already knew, that the idea, whether we're talking about the biblical literature or we're talking about extra-biblical literature, rabbinic literature, the idea of tikkun means to fix, to straighten out, to repair. So this is established across the board. No matter where I look, that's what I find. So whenever the rabbinic literature or the Masoretes use the idea or the phrase tikkun sopharim, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about certain instances where the sages, these Masorete scholars, these medieval textual scholars, where they made repairs. They fixed the text of the Bible. And by fix, I mean they fixed it they changed it. Now, just so you know, this is not picking on the Masoretes. This is not just speculation. These are not scholarly claims about changes without verification. What I'm going to talk about in this session is these are actual cases where, in their own words, in their own pen, the scribes say they changed the text. These are emendations of the scribes according to the words of the scribes themselves. Now, we have various lists that have come down to us that are preserved in various Hebrew manuscripts, lists that would be referred to as Masoretic list or list of the Masorah, list of these various notes and so forth. They're not all the same. They're all different, in fact, and there are many, many of these lists that are out there. But despite the fact that they vary, and that when it comes to these emendations, sometimes the list include certain passages which are not in every other list. In other words, you look at one list and you'll see a certain number of verses and a certain set of verses, and in another list there might be those same verses and a couple of extra. But one of the phrases that appears time and again, and it's in my BHS, my Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, which is the scholarly version of the Hebrew Bible. It's based on the Leningrad Codex, the earliest complete copy of the Hebrew Bible. You can find the link to get your own in the description below. But when I look at the notes, the Masoretic notes that are contained in that Bible, those notes reflect what was in the Leningrad Codex. So we have notes that are along the vertical side of the manuscript and notes in the horizontal. And the BHS contains quite a few of those. We're not going to get into the details of the Masoretic notes, the Magna and the Parva, the large and the small. Just know that I've verified these particular texts in my copy of the Leningrad Codex as presented in the BHS. Now, one of the phrases that appears in those notes, the notes that I can go look at in my Hebrew Bible, and you can also find these notes in other copies of the Masorah, is one note that says time and again, this, meaning, in other words, according to the Masorah, you'll see this particular verse is one of the 18 emendations of the scribes. In other words, 18 changes, this is the most frequently listed number of changes, 18, that are called Tikkun Soferim, the emendations of the scribes. Now, some of these lists in some of the manuscripts will trace these back to very remote times. So, for instance, we see sometimes that a certain list will say that the following verses were changed by Ezra. Some of the changes are attributed to Ezra and Nehemiah. Some are attributed to Ezra, Nehemiah, and the men of the great assembly or the great synagogue. Now, when I see that, one of the things that it reminds me of is a passage in the Mishnah. In the Mishnah, in Avot 1:1, some of you may know this from a particular document, rabbinic literature, that people refer to as Pirkei Avot, the sayings of the fathers or the ethics of the fathers. And here is Avot 1:1. Moses received the law from Sinai and committed it to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets committed it to the men of the great synagogue or the great assembly. They said three things: be deliberate in judgment, raise up many disciples, and make a fence around the law, a fence around the Torah. The reason that I bring this up, this particular passage from the Mishnah, in this particular class at this point, is because what is being conveyed in the Mishnah is a certain chain of custody that wants us to know that according to Jewish tradition, you are holding in your hands the very Torah that goes all the way back through this chain. Follow it back, the men of the Great Assembly, all the way back through the prophets and back to Moses himself where he received it at Sinai. But this chain of custody pulls us to the point where the last touchers, the last ones who touch the text, are this group, the men of the Great Assembly, this human chain of custody. Now, just in your notes, I want you to put that when we talk about chain of custody, one thing I don't read in that particular passage in the Mishnah, and I find it to be a striking omission, is that if we read Deuteronomy 31, verse 9, and Deuteronomy 31, verses 24 through 26, it says in the third person, when Moses finished writing, he gave this Torah, HaTorah Hazot, he gave this Torah to the elders and the Levites. There's no mention of the Levites in this particular passage. But we are talking about the chain of custody, and can we rely on the text? Is the text that I have in my Hebrew Bible, is the text that you have in your Hebrew Bible, can it be traced back with any degree of certainty as it stands to what Moses received at Horeb or Sinai? Now, there is a lot on the subject of today's session that you can find on the internet or in a library, if any of you still use a physical library or if you have a library in your home. But you can look up Tikkun Soferim and you can find quite a bit. For this presentation, I consulted several works that I had in my library. I looked at various things that I have saved on my computer, and I also consulted online sources. But one of the things that I use, particularly when I deal with textual transmission, is a book that was written and published in 1897 by Christian David Ginsburg. Christian David Ginsburg is a great Masoretic scholar. He's still well known and respected in the field to this day. This is his magnus opus. He wrote the introduction to the Masoretico-critical edition of the Hebrew Bible. I don't know that an editor today wouldn't have him name it something a little more simple, but Introduction to the Masoretico-critical edition of the Hebrew Bible. The bulk of what I'm bringing to you today is built on the back of the research that Christian David Ginsburg did in his Masoretic studies. Now, before I give you some of the examples, I want to tell you that these 18, and I'm only going to go through 5 in detail, but these 18 emendations of the scribes only scratch the surface when it comes to admitted changes and notes that we gather in our study of Masoretic literature. So in other words, I'm not focused on every change. I'm only going to give you 5 of the 18 of the emendations of the scribes, but there are many others, and we may go into some of those in other classes. They're outside the scope of today's class, but I'll give you an example. So there are quite a few changes that deal with just the heading, safeguarding of God's name. Now, in this particular category, or under this heading, we're going to see things like where the name of God is replaced. The Tetragrammaton, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, is replaced with Adonai. We're going to see other subjects that fall under this heading, such as theophoric names. You'll notice sometimes in the Bible where a name can be represented in English as Jehoash or Joash. Why is the same person called by different names? That falls under certain changes in the text, admitted changes, but that's another subject. And then there's one more that I really want to get into in a future class, and it answers the question of why someone like David, the sweet psalmist of Israel, the king, Melech Yisrael, the king of Israel, why would he name a son after Baal. Theophoric names that have been changed. And then, of course, a later writer, we see other texts where that name is changed. But again, these are scribal changes, but they're not the subject of today's class. Today's class is going to focus on very specific, a special group of scribal alterations, and even a subgroup within that group. These 5 examples are what we're going to cover today. There are 5. Number 1, Genesis 18 and verse 22. Now, I've called this particular example, putting Abraham in his place. The titles, by the way, are mine, so bear with me as I go through them. Number 2 is going to be from Numbers 11 and 15. The evil of God? Question mark. Number 3, Moses' mama. Numbers chapter 12 and verse 12. Hey, the titles, I put them together. If you don't like them, maybe you can clean them up and present them to your friends differently. This is the way they came to me when I was studying. Number 4 is 2 Samuel chapter 20 and verse 1. I've called this one Israel's Other Gods. That's right. And number 5, Zechariah chapter 2 and verse 12, or verse 8 in the English Bible. And I've called this one the Eye of God. Okay, here we go. Without further ado, case number 1, putting Abraham in his place. Now, when we deal with Genesis chapter 18, we're already dealing with a text that you can imagine later theology would have a problem with this particular text. We're going to read the verse that was changed by the scribes in just a moment, but I wanted to give you a little bit of context. In Genesis chapter 18, it says that Abraham lifts up his eyes and Jehovah appears to him. Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, this is the Tetragrammaton. And it says very clearly in verse 2 that he lifted his eyes and he saw and behold Shlosha Anashim, 3 men. Now, it's very clear from the context, no matter what you do with it, that this is an appearance of God to Abraham. Now, later theology is going to really have a problem, not just with this particular part of Genesis 18, but with quite a bit. We're not going to go into all of that. But I want you to look with me at Genesis chapter 18 and verse 22. Genesis 18 and verse 22. And I'm going to read from the ASV. And the men turned from thence and went toward Sodom, but Abraham stood yet before Jehovah. Now, evidently, this word, this phrase, this verse became a problem at some point, and it was altered. It wasn't just altered, and I'm not guessing that it was altered. I have a rabbinic note. I have a Masoretic note that's in my Hebrew Bible. Other Masoretic scholars have pointed this out. Ginsburg has an entire section on this particular passage, and it says that the text, but Abraham stood yet before Jehovah, originally had that swapped. But Jehovah stood yet before Abraham. And they admit it. Now you say, well, that's not a big deal. Why would you change that? Here's the note that Ginsburg writes in his critical, Masoretico-critical edition of the Hebrew Bible based on his survey of Masoretic notes. Since, he says, prescribes the phrase to stand before another is at times used to indicate inferiority and homage, it was deemed derogatory to the deity to say that the Lord stood before Abraham. So the text is swapped, and we get what we have in the English. Abraham stood yet before Jehovah. Now, in the chat, you're going to see several passages which Ginsburg lists for us to go look at. In other words, examples where this idea that the one who stood before another indicates inferiority and homage. Those texts are Genesis 18, Genesis 41, Deuteronomy 1, Deuteronomy 10, Deuteronomy 18. You'll see those in the text. You can look at them later. They're also in the description. Now, outside the scope of this class, but I can't help but point it out, is another scribal change having to do with Genesis chapter 18. It's another type of textual alteration. Ginsburg notes this as well. In Genesis 18 alone, there are 5 places very clearly indicated in the Masoretico notes where the name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh is substituted for Adonai. It's like we can't have this particular passage say Jehovah or Yahweh, Yahuwah, however you pronounce the Tetragrammaton. Pick your pronunciation. I'm happy with that. They didn't want it to say that, so it was swapped. Now, Ginsburg points out 134 places in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible alone, where the Tetragrammaton is swapped for the name Adonai is swapped out for the Tetragrammaton. So someone had a problem with these. And by the way, I will upload a document that contains all of those verses for members of the Yachad. I'm going to put that on all of our places where we normally post that so that you can study those. So in this particular case, in Genesis 18:22, putting Abraham in his place was a way that the scribes, the Masoretes, said, we can't have it say this, so we're going to swap Jehovah and Abraham now. It's better. That's number 1 that I'm covering today. Number 2, case number 2 is Numbers chapter 11 and verse 15. So if you go with me, let's read Numbers chapter 11 and verse 15, and we'll see the way our Bibles say it now. And then we'll look at what did it say. In Numbers chapter 11, verse 15, and if thou deal thus with me, by the way, this is Moses talking to God, kill me, I pray thee, out of hand, if I have found favor in thy sight, and let me not see my wretchedness. Now, the phrase my wretchedness, it really, in Hebrew, it could be translated my evil. But the question is, how does that make sense in context? Now, Numbers chapter 11, you read the chapter, God is angry at the people and some problems come from his anger, right? The result is many people find themselves in dire straits, let's just say. So Moses is in a place of intercession in Numbers chapter 11. And what he says here in this translation, according to the Hebrew, as it has been altered, Moses says, if you're going to deal this way with me, just kill me so that I might not see my evil. But in the original, according to the Masoretic notes, the scribes said, it originally said, let me not see, that I may not see thy evil, meaning referring to God. So you can imagine how someone doesn't like the way that comes across. So here are some of the notes that Ginsburg wrote. In other words, that I may not see your evil, the evil or punishment wherewith thou wilt visit Israel. So he didn't want to see what God was going to do to Israel, so he's asking, according to the original reading, contextually, that God would just take him out so that he doesn't have to witness this. Now, the Jerusalem Targum deals with it a little bit differently than what we see with the Masoretic scribes. They also changed the text because none of these scribes, none of these feel comfortable saying that Moses says that God has an evil side. Well, the way they handled it was they translated it, or they they represented it by saying that I may not see the evil of your people. So they add that phrase so that it's not referring to Moses, it's not referring to God, and there you go. And so this is just another case. In this particular case, the scribes made the change so that at all cost, evil would not be, or bad, if you would prefer to say ra is bad, that bad would not be ascribed to Jehovah. That is case number 2. Case number 3 deals with Moses's mother. Now let's look at Numbers chapter 12 and verse 12. Now let me just tell you that there are 3 of these tikkun sopharim in the Pentateuch. The first one is Genesis 22, we read earlier, or Genesis 18, verse 22, Numbers chapter 11, verse 15, and then Numbers chapter 12 and verse 12. Now the English, as we have it now, says, "Let her not, I pray, be as one dead, of whom the flesh is half consumed when he cometh out of his mother's womb." Now, most of you are going to remember the context of this story. In Numbers chapter 12, the sister and brother of Moses, according to the priestly pen, we have Miriam, we have Aaron, and we have Moses. And in this particular case, there is a squabble, if you will, over leadership. Why is Moses considered great? Here we are, we're prophets too. You remember this in Numbers chapter 12. They're also a little bit upset over Moses' wife. Now, according to the Masoretic notes, in this particular passage, it didn't say what I just read. According to the Masoretic notes, this particular text, and this is the translation of the way it originally read, "Let her not," Miriam, I pray, "be as the dead-born child, which when proceeding from our mother's womb, the half of our flesh is consumed." Now, if you imagine, this particular text is very personal. If Moses and Miriam and Aaron are contextually in the story, and Moses is praying to God about, don't let her, remember she has leprosy because she's criticized the wife of Moses, he says, don't let her be as a dead-born child, and he describes it very personally, our mother, right? Our mother's womb, our flesh. Now, in this particular case, according to the Masoretic notes, this was deemed derogatory towards the mother of the great lawgiver. So they wanted to protect the mother of the great lawgiver. Like, this is just too brash. We can't say something like this in regards to the mother of the lawgiver. So it was changed. It was altered, therefore, from the first person, plural, our, to a very impersonal, to a child, just generally to a child that was stillborn. This particular example indicates a heightened sense of respect towards Moses and his mama, as I put it. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. The question is, what authority do we have to change the text in each of these examples? Case number 4. In case number 4, which I've called Israel's Other Gods, I think this one is quite interesting. And we're going to go to 2 Samuel chapter 20 and verse 1. 2 Samuel chapter 20 and verse 1. Now, here's what it says now. And there happened to be there a base fellow whose name was Sheva, the son of Bichri, a Benjamite. And he blew the trumpet and said, "We have no portion in David, neither have we inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to his tents, O Israel." Now, when you first read this particular text, you don't see anything that would really stand out. To your tents, O Israel. In other words, if you see this particular verse, nothing really strikes you as, what did they change? This one is quite interesting. In fact, this phrase, we have no share with David, to your tents, O Israel, appears in a couple of other texts as well. We're going to put those in the chat for you. They're also in the description. Those other occurrences are 1 Kings 12:16 and 2 Chronicles chapter 10 and verse 16. Now, the way the quote is handled here, according to the Scribes, we just read the amended version. The original didn't say, to your tents, O Israel. It originally said, to your gods, O Israel. To your gods, well, you can imagine that certain scribes didn't want this particular obvious allusion to the fact that Israel is going after other gods. Now, I don't know why this particular text stood out among the myriad of others, but this is one of the changes. Now, this change is interesting because they didn't swap the word order, and they didn't just add a letter or change a pronoun. What they did here is something different. Very craftily, the word that says to your tents, a tent in Hebrew is ohelim. An ohel is a tent. The word for Elohim uses the same letters. But the scribe, according to their admission, according to their notes, they changed two consonants. So instead of saying Ohelim, they moved two consonants, and it originally said Elohim, to your gods, O Israel. But just a little swap, voila, it's fixed. Now you say, well, how do we know that it originally said Elohim and not Ohelim? Well, first of all, they admit that. They say that's what it said. But another example, and I would ask you to do this on your own just to save time, if you go to the example in 1 Kings chapter 12, you'll see the verse in question, because these were changed as well. You'll see verse 16, but then if you go down to verse 28, what is the first thing that Israel did? They set up gods in Dan and Bethel. That's what they did. They said, to your gods, O Israel, and then they did it. So this is sort of a confirmation on top of what we already know. Now, case number 5, the eye of God. Now, in this one, look with me at Zechariah chapter 12, chapter 2, and verse 8 in the English, verse 12 in the Hebrew. And here's what it says now, after the change. For thus says Jehovah of hosts, after glory hath he sent me unto the nations which plundered you. For he that touches you toucheth the apple of his eye. How do you make sense out of that? Jehovah of hosts is talking, and he says that he sent, and he says that whoever touches you, meaning Israel, touches the apple of his eye. Who is his? Who does the pronoun refer to here? According to the note, according to the Masoretic note, this originally said, he that toucheth you, Israel, toucheth the apple of my eye. Well, now this is a problem, particularly later theologically, because God doesn't have an eye. It's too anthropomorphic. So theology has evolved to the point where that's not acceptable. Now, it's interesting. You might say, yeah, but there are other verses, Ross, which talk about the eyes of the Lord go to and fro and so forth. Well, that's okay because someone else is saying it. The problem, according to Ginsburg and other Masoretic scholars, is that in this particular verse, and only this particular verse, it's God himself who refers to his eye. It's okay if someone else makes a mistake and says something using anthropomorphic language, but certainly we have to have God align with the later theology. So that's where it becomes a problem. In fact, let me read a note that I have in Ginsburg to give you a little bit more background on this particular, the thought behind that. Here, this is on page 359. If you ever decide to find this book, Introduction to the Masoretic, Critical Edition of the Hebrew Bible. This is on page 359. In Deuteronomy 32, the phrase is not exactly the same since it is here, the apple of his eye, which is also translated as the apple of his eye. In other words, Deuteronomy says the same thing. There was no necessity for any alteration here because the expression does not necessarily refer to God. The passage may mean God kept Israel as one keeps the apple of his eye. The Septuagint, the Jerusalem Targum, and the Syriac omit the article altogether. In other words, Septuagint, Targum, and Syriac have this: he kept Israel as the eye apple. Well, that solves it. You just take out any pronoun that could possibly point to God's eye. You see that? While onkelos, who translate the passage in the plural, renders the suffix also in the plural. He kept them as the apple of their eye. So God is keeping Israel as their own eye apple. Well, that doesn't make sense. But we just have to change the text to keep the theology straight in these examples. Now, at times, the way I would put this, at times, those responsible for transmitting the sacred text, they made changes. And this isn't just me making this up. The 5 examples I gave you are examples in their own words. They said, here's what the Bible says now. Here's what it said before we changed it. These changes, quite often, I believe, it's very clear, are meant to bring the text more in line with the current theology. Now, there are plenty of other examples, I assure you. Plenty of other examples can be brought forward. So my question to you is, what do you think? What do you think about these changes, these admitted changes to the text? Should religious authorities have made changes to the sacred text? Should letters be swapped or dropped or rearranged to make Scripture fit theology? Are you interested in learning about more changes when it comes to the Hebrew Bible? And I know a lot of people get a little uncomfortable with this because they've been told that it's letter perfect, not one jot or one tittle. But when we say that, we're holding the biblical text to a higher standard than the people who transmitted it to us. They admit changes were made. In some cases, they tell us where they made these and why they made them. Are you interested in learning more, such as changes to remove expressions that the transmitters of the text felt were indelicate, anthropomorphic, or impious? Changes related to God's name. We have records of those. If you're interested, let me know. Let me know in the comments if you're ready for more examples of reading the fine print. Like, share, and hype this video if you don't mind. And thanks as always for watching.